I'd like to introduce a very special guest and dear friend of mine, Madura. She is a renowned spoken word poet and graduate from the University of British Columbia. Thank you so much for joining me on Chai Chats. And to maybe help viewers get to know you, we were just thinking, would you mind introducing yourself and discussing why you decided to be with Chai Chats today?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Madura. And yeah, I moved from India when I was 12 years old. So I've lived longer there than I've lived here. And I think like every single immigrant, we all grapple with what it means to be from two different places at once. And there's a conversation I've had with a lot of my Indian friends. It's a conversation I've had with a lot of my immigrant friends. And I just thought it would be interesting to talk about my experience today and discuss it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think we're really excited to hear about your story. As you said, discussing with different groups, your immigrant friends, as well as the Indian community. And I think for a lot of folks, in terms of like finding our place in this world when we have different identities, and reconciling with those identities, I think it would be really cool, again, just to hear your story and hopefully can resonate with our viewers today. How would you describe your culture to someone who has no idea what it is? So perhaps you could begin by explaining your origins, as well as cherished celebrations, rituals, foods, arts, traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like how would you go about it to someone who has no idea?
Okay. So I think this for me is a very interesting thing because when I lived in India, during like social studies lessons, we would constantly learn about like how India is like one of the most diverse countries in the world. And I think when I was talking to someone who was from Canada when they visited India, they were talking about, wait, no, like India is not really diverse, like India is actually like, and in my head, I was like, oh, you don't know that. But I think there's two different senses of diverse, right? Like within India, there are so many religions, so many cultures, so many official and unofficial languages. And I think even my background from within India is like pretty diverse because my dad was born in Hindupur. My mom was born near Chennai, but like Tirutani. So my mom like grew up in Chennai. My dad grew up in Hindupur. So she like speaks Tamil just as fluently as she speaks Telugu. And and then my dad like spoke and grew up learning Telugu. And then they both moved together to Bangalore, where the language is Kannada. So my mom, she speaks like 5 different languages. So it's like Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, Hindi, English, and Gujarati. So she like speaks and understands all these different languages. And for me, I speak Telugu, I think, passably well. I understand Telugu really well. I understand Tamil. I can't speak Tamil as well, but I understand Kannada as well. And I can read Hindi, shockingly, even though my education reading Hindi ended in 6th grade.
Oh,
but
wow.
yeah, I know. I tested it the other day and I was like, wait, I can still read. So yeah, understanding Hindi is a little more difficult for me. But I think it's just, so within like South India itself, there is so much diversity, and I didn't fully understand what the other person was talking about till I moved to Canada. And then I was like, wait, there are so many cultures here, like you don't understand that culture here is something different. And you don't really realize that you have a culture till you move here, if that makes sense. Like I didn't know I had a culture till I moved here because people were like, oh, like what is your culture? And it's like, it was the way I grew up, it was my way of life. Like it wasn't anything to be branded a culture. So I think at least when I first moved here, it was a little bit disheartening to see like when you talk about different cultures, you kind of lose the nuance within each culture. Like when everybody is considered brown, like of course we're all in solidarity, but I think to say that every single person within this certain ethnic group acts a certain way or has a similar culture is a little wild to me, because all that nuance is wiped out, and so for me, at least, like coming here and realizing I had a culture was a really big shock. So I guess in that sense, when I did come here, understand like why people like hold on to their roots more strongly, because it's like, especially, you know, my parents, and I'm sure a lot of other immigrants, because it's like, this is what ties you to your homeland, like what ties you to where you were from. And I can completely see why that happens. So for example, coming here, you participate in all the like really major celebrations, like, you know, Diwali and Holi, but we'd also continue doing like all the celebrations we had in India. Like one of my mom's favorite festivals is Pongal, and or for my dad, Sankranti, which is like, you know, our Happy New Year. So my mom would still like make pal pongal, which is like one of my favorite dishes of all time, and just like, you know, like our like Krishna Janmashtami, just like, I think all these festivals that I grew up doing that I didn't really, it would happen no matter what, right? It's different like coming here, and I think having to continue that, especially when you don't necessarily aren't doing it with family, and you don't like have like statutory holidays for them or anything. And yeah, so I guess that's where I came from. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to a
Not at
simple
all.
way, but, you
You
know.
mentioned, I think, really key points in terms of realizing that you have a culture once coming to, say, a Western country like Canada, right? I think that's definitely very relatable for a lot of people.
Mhm.
And you mentioned some of your cultural celebrations like Pongal. So this may lead perfectly into the next question, but what would be one of your favorite cultural celebrations? And could you describe it using five senses? So like what colors are
Oh.
used? What are the flavors? What food is eaten? Are there rituals? If so, how are they conducted? What do they mean? Sort of give us like a very sensory experience.
Okay, so another caveat to growing up in India is that you just kind of let things happen and you don't think about them too much. You know what I mean? Or
Fair
like the significance, because it's just like, that's what like my mom and other aunties, you know, family members, they'd all wake up really early in the morning. They'd all shower, and then they'd prepare like the tons of like food that we'd all eat. And then they'd start doing the pujas, whereas like the rest of us kids would kind of peter in slowly, starting like 8 or 9 in the morning, all kind of hungry. So you just kind of do what they tell you. And I guess what's one of my favorite celebrations? Sure, we can talk about Pongal since I already mentioned it, Pongal or Sankranti. So Pongal is like extremely popular in Tamil Nadu, or it's like it's mostly done there. And Sankranti is what it's known as in Andhra Pradesh. So it's essentially celebrating like the harvest of crops, or like the start of a new year. And so you usually like have a holiday of some kind, and people like, you know, dress up in new clothes. At least we used to. So I don't know if that's a, yeah. And Pongal is essentially just like a multi-day celebration for the harvest. And it's like there are different like varieties of Pongal. So there's like Chakkar Pongal. Chakkar means like sugar. So like there's sweet Pongal, which is like the dessert. Then there's the other Pongal that's there with like a tamarind chutney, tamarind and like ginger chutney. So Pongal is just like essentially just like fancy rice, we can call it. Sure, like it's like cooked lentils, and like, you know, and that's given flavor. And then there's like pal pongal, which is just rice like boiled in milk for a long time. That is absolutely delicious. I love it. So my mom makes like those three pongals. She was also talking about like how when she was as a kid, like with pongal, she would like go to her like her grandma's place for a whole week, and they would have like different practices they would do. Like for instance, you like clean out your entire home, like you burn all of the like things that you don't need anymore. So it's just like essentially a fresh start, I think. So for us, we wake up and then we pray, we do puja, and then we eat a really good meal, go to the temple sometimes, and, you know, like wear new clothes. So yeah, I guess that's what Pongal is to me. Or yeah, Shankranti. Yeah, so yeah, Sankranti is the same as Pongal. It's just known differently in different places. And I think that's just another sign of like how diverse even just people within South India and within certain states are. And each person, like each group of people has yeah, they just have their own celebrations and cultural traditions and foods. And yeah, it varies so much like within just my family too. I think like on my dad's side and my mom's side, you probably see that too. Yeah. When I was in India, I was put into like a Bharatanatyam class in grade 1. So that's like the classic dance for anyone who doesn't know. And my teacher was pretty intense. And I know a lot of teachers are out there, but I was truly terrified of her.
Oh no.
And she recommended this other like music teacher who I sang with for a long time. And she gave me lessons through Skype and even years after I came to Canada. So while I stopped dancing Bharatanatyam like 15 years ago, I continued on with like Carnatic music. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of the times I was forced to practice, I was forced and sent to class. But I think like the reason that I kind of like tolerated it, even at that point in time, is because I really loved it. I'm just not a very disciplined person. And as Akil knows, and all my friends know, I'm late to absolutely everything. And when you are in the pursuit of like you're learning, classical music and Carnatic music or Bharatanatyam, time is very valued and discipline is very valued. So I think that was kind of where, I felt stressed. But other than that, like I absolutely love to sing and I love all the different Carnatic songs and the music that my parents play at 7 a.m. sometimes. So
Relatable. One question that I do have is, how did you perceive your culture growing up, as a child, engaging in all of these celebrations and eating the food, versus the way that you identify with it right now? Has anything changed, or would you say it's remained pretty much constant?
Okay. So I think my personality has always been like the type that when someone has spoken out against something, I come back stronger almost. So I think obviously like when I first moved to Canada, like I had extremely long hair. I would eat like very Indian food and it's like my accent got made fun of like constantly. But like my way of like kind of hitting back against that way, which was like very different from other kids. And this is just because like of who I am, I think, is that I would speak even in an even stronger accent. Like I would bring, all the food that my mom made. And it was a way of standing up for myself. And I also think it helped that the people I was surrounded by, like at least my friends, they didn't really care about any of these things, so it was just as long as the people that I cared about weren't judging me and making fun of me for something that's like an integral part of who I am. And so it didn't like super matter to me what others were saying, but I know this is like very different from an experience that other people had. I think it may have been different if I grew up here, but I moved like from India when I was like 12, and 12 I think is an age where there's a lot of like obviously insecurities and doubts about who you are, but at the same time a way for me to like combat that was to, I think, stand against all these stereotypes that people had. Like for instance, one of my dad's colleagues daughters, she also moved the same time as I did, and her science teacher was like, oh, like how do you live in India, like do like elephants walk through the streets, and like this is coming from her like science teacher. And I think for the two of us it was kind of ludicrous that India has like the largest English speaking population in the world. The fact that people would be surprised that our grasp of like English was so high. And I think my relationship with that has changed over time. Back in the day, I was like, oh, like, of course I know English, like, how would I not know English? Like, I think my grammar is probably better than yours because growing up in like, yeah, but now I kind of understand that it's a product of like British colonial rule, and people shouldn't be able to speak English perfectly or properly in order to be taken seriously. Because I think there have been times when I like will walk into the grocery store, and my mom studied in an English like school since she was really young. My dad didn't till he was much older, but they both do have like very strong Indian accents, even though their English, honestly, I think their English is better than mine, like more grammatically correct. And when they like talk to the cashiers, for instance, a lot of the times the cashiers will look towards me for confirmation. And I think it's just because like it just takes a little bit more to understand them, probably maybe because of their accent. But I think being looked at as like the authority figure just because my accent is cleaner and, is pretty disheartening. So I think just that is something that has changed over time, is just my understanding that just because there's a standard and I adhere to it doesn't make me better necessarily than people who don't reach that standard. So it is possible to be from like these two vastly different places, and it's possible to be in that like in between space where you can wholeheartedly be yourself and do whatever you choose, and whatever practices you want to hold on to, and also be this like person who is completely valid in their beliefs and completely valid in their where they're from. So I think that was kind of mixing those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what you just said there, it's okay to be in between, that you don't have to choose between
The two.
two
Yeah.
identities. And I think even for me growing up, that's something that I did struggle with, was not appearing to be very Canadian, still holding on to like my cultural ties. But then on the other hand, oh, you're being too whitewashed and you're not being Indian enough, right? And sort of what's the middle ground? Yeah.
It's just people come from very different places. Sometimes like they were forced to like embrace this culture, which would get them made fun of in school and stuff like that. So, and I think, yeah, it brings up on like feelings of like shame or like guilt. And I think I completely understand like where they're coming from now more so, but it was just even growing up as a kid, I think if you were like too fresh off the boat, you would be made fun of like by other Indian people for like being too cultured. So I think it wasn't just like non-Indian people who are making fun of you, but also like Indian people. So it was like a weird line to walk, I think, where it's just like I'm not actually embarrassed by these things, but I also understand like where you're coming from, is only an understanding I kind of got when I grew up, because it's just I don't think they like meant to make fun of me, but it was just like that's the way that they reacted to the situation around them and their circumstances, which are entirely different from mine. And I have to say, like, my parents helped a lot with it too, I think, because yeah, they didn't really force me to do anything that I didn't want to do, and they just kind of taught me and let me be me, and I think that helped a lot.
Yeah, thank you for again sharing your story. And I think it's so inspiring, as you said earlier, that you stood your ground.
That's the thing, right? Because I think there's like, even within that sliding scale, every single person on there is very legitimate. And I think as a kid, I was like, only if I check all these boxes, I'm legitimized, which means that other people who don't check these boxes are not like legitimized. And I think that's like that wasn't a fair standard of mine to like impose either, right? So I think it's everyone is like on their own journey.
Yeah, I would say, what kind of cultural values or practices are important to you, and whether or not they affect your daily life? Like, are they things that you uphold day to day, just as a human being? Are there any things that you carry either from your parents' teachings or even just your cultural practices?
So I think one of the main things that this is from my culture, but also my family, is respect for things, like not just people, but more specifically, like as a kid, my mom wouldn't let me kick like books, for instance, because books are like saraswati, books are knowledge. So every time like I'd accidentally kick something, and I'm not saying all things need to be respected, but I think it just built this like ingrained sense of respect for knowledge, for also food. Like we wouldn't really be allowed to like throw away food, or we'd save it for a different day, for instance. And I think like while eating food, yeah, to like disrespect or like throw food and stuff, like we weren't allowed to do any of those things. And I think just like learning that respect for books, that respect for knowledge, that respect for food, it kind of just made me value all of the things that I have in my life. And that was just further emphasized by like my mom, who was also, and my dad, who taught me like the values of like being empathetic, which is super important. So people coming from different cultures, people coming from different backgrounds, not to judge them by their status, by their money, like what sort of things they own, for instance, or like what sort of like religious backgrounds they come from, or like cultural backgrounds, but just to be open to everybody and to talk to them and, you know, respect them. So I think one thing I would say is that to respect your place in society, to respect your place at home, to respect yourself, to respect the things around you. And I think that was one of the most important things I learned, because I think it does force you to be a more empathetic person. It forces you to take into consideration, I think, I guess, all the things you should be thankful for and all the things you have in your life, and also to not take it for granted. So, yeah.
Very true words.
Also, just to add to that, in South India, I don't know, probably North India too, is my absolute favorite fruit is available that I haven't had in a lot of years. I've only had it once in the last 10 years. It makes me extremely sad. So it's called nungu, or ice apple. Okay, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but one of my absolute favorite dishes was my grandma. So nungu looks very cool. I would recommend you search it up, but it's just essentially like a sort of like thick jelly sort of fruit with like water on the inside. So my grandma would like cut it up during the summers, put it along with milk and mango, and like I would I would eat it like soup or like a pudding, and it was absolutely delicious. But because like I don't go back during Indian summers, it's not really available. So I've only had it once in the last like 10 years since I moved from there, even though I've been back to India many times. So I think just highly recommend, if anyone ever goes to India and you're there during the summer, please get nungu.
I will do that personally. Thanks for telling me. What are ways we can preserve our cultural stories and traditions? Given that sort of this is what Chai Chats is all about, is uplifting these stories that are often unheard, and, you know, the importance of storytelling and, you know, acknowledging our roots, but also acknowledging that things are changing, right? So how do we sort of reconcile with, you know, generations of this generation, even future generations, while also, you know, acknowledging and, you know, showing our respect to our past?
Okay. All right. So I think this is obviously my personal opinion, is I think that we all should have like a moral value scale that is separate from religion, separate from like your parents, as in like it's your own personal one, and that can incorporate what you think in life and what you believe in life, and can change through time as you grow older, as you accrue experiences. And I think that for me, at least, the way the world is definitely changing. I think we all know that it's globalized and is globalizing at a very fast pace. And I think just like having grown up in India and having come here, it's something that I've also pondered, like, what will I be taking on to like my future life? Like, what are the practices that I will be continuing on? So I think that honestly, social media does help a lot. So if there's anything that we don't know about, we would like to learn more about, I think we have so much information like at our fingertips, right? And so many people like sharing their experiences. So I think it's very much possible like to like also, you know, use the knowledge of your elders, like, you know, like my parents, my grandparents, what sort of practices they have, like what practices you like within those that you would like to take forward with you. For example, like, yeah, respect for things, or like certain like cultural celebrations and just certain values. And I think another important way in which like culture can kind of go through this change and be taken is, like you mentioned before, through art. So art by way of music, art by way of writing, art by way of dancing, movies. And I think it's a lot more accessible, and it's a much easier way, I think, for people to connect with culture. And it doesn't feel like something that's a chore, right? But it's just a part of your life and part of who you are. Like, and drinking chai. So a really big one is, I think, food as well. Food like different foods for me come from different places. Like, you know, like there are certain foods that I can look at and I'm like, oh, this is like something specific to like Bangalore or to Karnataka, and something more specific to Andhra Pradesh, or like, or it's like a mix of both, you know, and this is like something that my parents adopted from this part of India. So it's just, I think, just the sort of food I eat at home, the vegetables, the names I have for those vegetables, a lot of which I don't know in English. For example, I've been eating taro apparently my whole life, but I didn't know that because it's called chamagedda in Telugu, and I've never like bought it or helped my mom make it because I cut other vegetables. But for some reason, I found out a month ago that like when I came here and started drinking taro bubble tea, I thought that was like a completely mind-blowing like new root that I had never heard of. But I've been eating chamagedda my whole life and I love it. Like it's deep fried in spices and it is absolutely delicious. So I think another way for me to connect that is like finding those similarities and those contrasts between people's lives, and yeah, being respectful of those and just integrating it into your life in such a way that, you know, it doesn't feel like an obligation or a chore, but it's just who you are. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's yeah.
Those are really powerful words. And you mentioned, right, taking taking what works within our current generation, right, and just technology, social media, and of course, you know, there are, you know, downsides and there are detriments that exist, but knowing that once we acknowledge those detriments and the negative sides, how can we then take what's working, I guess, within our generation and incorporate that so that it no longer feels like a chore. So, you know, storytelling using social media like this platform, even just sharing different dances like you did earlier today. Um, and even, again, as you mentioned, talking to our elders, to our grandparents, just engaging in more discussions with not only with people of our own background, also with other cultures, with other people, for example, in India, knowing how diverse it is, to sort of, so that we're also aware of other communities within our, you know, vicinities or spaces. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Madura, for you know, sharing your story. And I think there's so much that I learned from it personally as well, even in terms of my my South Indian identity. And yeah, it's very inspiring. And yeah, thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.